Let me begin by welcoming you all to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science here at Brown. And I'm honored to serve this year as interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome also to the many Brown students, faculty, and alumni joining us virtually today in light of the challenges of the pandemic. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. The Taubman Center for several years has focused its efforts on three themes: the pursuit of security, the cost of living, and challenges to our democracy in America. This year, we're placing special emphasis on the national elections and the subsequent consequences as the nation grapples with issues of social justice, public health, education, the economy, and the commitment to the rule of law. With a roster of outstanding speakers and programs. Today, we present the second in the series of election-related events with a presentation from an outstanding political scientist and expert, Rachael Cobb. Rachael is an associate professor at Suffolk University, where she chairs the political science department. Incidentally, she's both a friend and a former colleague of mine. She specializes in U.S. elections, election administration, electoral policies, civic engagement, and political participation. In 2006, Professor Cobb received a grant from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission to establish the University Poll Workers Project, a nonpartisan program designed to recruit college students as poll workers as a response to reports of an estimated shortage of 500,000 poll workers nationwide. Since 2006, more than 500 students from the greater Boston area have received training and worked as poll workers. Today, in her talk entitled Voting During a Pandemic, Legitimacy, Safety, and Viability, she will address the challenge in election policies growing out of the global pandemic we face as we approach the 2020 elections, including a likely great increase in mail-in voting, adding new challenges both to the conduct of the election and counting the vote, among other issues. She will examine as well the critical effects of Americans' faith in the critical effect on Americans' faith in the outcome of the election. Rachael will speak for approximately 20 minutes, followed by a brief discussion between myself and our guest, which will then be followed by questions and answers with the audience for the remainder of our time up until 1 o'clock. You may enter questions through the Q&A box function, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the event. Please keep them short and to the point. I will convey as many of these questions to Rachael as we have time for. Please indicate if you would like me not to use your name in asking the question. The event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. And so without any further ado, let me introduce our guest, Rachael Cobb.
Thank you, Rich, and it is a pleasure to be here today and to see you again, and thank you for inviting me. So I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, mainly as sort of a guide and with some visuals that I hope are useful to all of us. So I'm going to share my screen and just make sure that the technology goes well for all of us. There we go, hoping that works. Okay, so today's title is Legitimacy, Safety, and Viability. And what I want to talk about to begin with is legitimacy. And the reason I start with that is because when we think about legitimacy in democratic theory, that is kind of the underpinning of the whole endeavor, that we recognize that there is an authority that we have put into place and elected, and that voter confidence in our election system is crucial because elections are the link between citizens and their elected officials. So in a representative democracy, it's the ballot box that allows us to send elected leaders mandates for the policies and then hold them accountable. But critically, if voters do not have confidence that their vote is counted correctly, then the most fundamental aspect of representative democracy, the direct election of leaders, is in doubt. So even though there will always be winners and losers, voters should still have confidence in their electoral system, and they should believe that when there is human error and hiccups, which there always are, that the will of the people is still reflected in the results of the election. So I want to begin with this term confidence. And it's something that since the 2000 election, there's been a growth, really an explosion in scholarship of election performance and the development, indeed, of the scholarship of the performance of elections. And that is based at MIT. The survey of the performance of American elections, it's the only public opinion data set of questions dedicated explicitly to understanding how voters themselves experience the electoral process. And it provides a comprehensive nationwide data set at the state level documenting election issues as experienced by voters. So when we look at confidence, we might ask, what are the factors that impact people's evaluation of election performance? And so the question is, how confident are you that your vote in the general election was counted as you intended? So in the 2016 presidential election, 66% of respondents said that they were very confident, and 27% said that they were somewhat confident, which gives us some confidence that overall there is general confidence. However, we break that up a little bit and go into the survey and examine this in further detail, and find that this confidence actually has some connection to your party identification. So when a Democrat wins, Democratic identifiers are more confident that the election results are what they should be. And when a Republican wins, Republican identifiers are more confident. We also want to look at things like the voting experience. What was it like for you to vote? When you went to the polls, were you treated with dignity and respect? Did you have to wait in a long line? Was the process fairly smooth? Even if your name wasn't on the list, was there a way for you to get help quickly and efficiently and in a way that you felt confident that the people who were managing that election were doing it in a competent way? And so we found in public opinion surveys that voter confidence and satisfaction is highly correlated with the positive evaluations of poll worker performance. So that is to say, when poll workers perform in a way that voters feel did a good job, then they have confidence in the system. When poll workers have difficulty, then voters feel a little less confident. Another thing that gives us information about the voting experience is whether people had to wait in line for a long time. If they have to wait in a long time, they feel less confident that their vote will be counted as intended. So it's not just that they're annoyed that they had to wait a really long time, they actually have less confidence in the overall system. And the other thing that we've found in public opinion polls is that voting absentee, people who engage in that method of voting have less confidence that their vote was counted. So we go back to the survey and examine in further detail. If you voted on election day itself, were you more confident than if you voted mail or absentee? And you see that 68% of people who voted on election day were very confident. 62% of people who voted absentee or by mail were very confident. This number, those 60% range, actually has gone up, especially in the category of absentee mail voting, because so many more people have taken advantage of it in the states that have moved to all mail voting. So now we might ask, okay, well, what about race and ethnicity? What role does that play in confidence in our elections? And when we look at this, African Americans were split in 2016. 50% very confident, 50% not confident, versus the 2012 numbers, 76% of African Americans were confident in 2012. So a huge decline in 2016. We also see that non-white Hispanic voters were confident and actually much higher than African Americans. And whites had a 70% rate of being very confident versus 61% in 2012. So unpacking why the results are so disparate is not an easy task, and it is not the focus entirely of this talk. But was the high vote in confidence by African Americans in 2012 due in large part to President Obama's bid and victorious reelection, or something else? Or was the decline in support attributable to the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which essentially took the teeth out of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act? I think this area deserves further attention, and it will be interesting to see what happens in the upcoming 2020 election. I think the obvious points from the results are that differences do exist across race and ethnicity regarding confidence in the American election system, and that there is, in fact, polarization by race. So when we look at the consolidated question, combining very confident and somewhat confident, we see that 95% of white voters, but only 85% of African American voters were either very or somewhat confident in the 2016 election. So the main takeaway here, and if we look at partisanship, is that partisanship and the lens through which we identify impacts our confidence in how the election results can be interpreted. So this has profound results for 2020. And one of the things that we're seeing right now in public opinion polls for 2020 is that big majorities of Democrats are favoring vote by mail, and majorities of Republicans are opposing vote by mail. So depending on who uses what method of voting, that should have profound implications for everyone's confidence in the results of the election, which goes back to legitimacy and whether the results are viewed as being legitimate by all of these different categories of people. All right, so putting that aside, I want to now turn to safety. And I actually think the good news on safety is that we have learned a lot since the beginning of the pandemic. And we have adjusted our ways of lives. We have adjusted the way we do things. And it means that we have some real knowledge already about how to organize space and how to organize ourselves as people in locations. When we think about going grocery shopping or we're accessing public services, there are designs that have happened in those locations that mean that we know how to do things. So the Centers for Disease Control has provided guidance to election administrators across the country about how to design polling places so that they're safe, what materials they need to order, recommendations for voters. And so the good news is election administrators are not doing this without any support. They have quite a bit of support coming from the government, but also from their local governments as well. In addition, MIT and Stanford have created the Healthy Elections project. And this is a funded project with a lot of people working on it, trying to use human-centered design to make elections safer and more accessible. And they are providing tools for how to design healthy in-person polling places, including things like ticketing systems, how to manage long lines, how to deal with social distancing, how to cope with bottlenecks, how to cope with surges in voters, how to site polling locations so that they are both accessible to neighborhoods and also safe polling locations that have enough distance in them to enable safe voting. So the good news is that a lot of great and helpful minds are working to provide election administrators with easy to use tools that really do work and help and will make a significant difference. And I want to put in a plug here to just note the value that universities are offering here to help solve public problems. And they have really stepped up to the challenge and have provided all of these materials to election administrators across the country. So finally, I want to turn to viability, and here look at the checkpoints in the system. Essentially, what are the steps that it takes to vote, and how do we deal with that in this climate and under these conditions? And then what are the methods of clear communication that election administrators need to do because of many of the changes that are happening? And what do we have to think about regarding poll worker training? So the first thing I want to do is walk through in-person voting and what it takes to vote. And if you're going to vote in person, because there are a series of distinct events. The first thing that you have to do in almost all states is register to vote. After you've registered, you have to find your polling location, and then you have to go to the polling location. And then when you are there and ready to vote, your ballot, you need to be authenticated and then given the ballot. And then you mark your ballot, and then you deposit the ballot for tabulation. So now I'm going to walk through all of the things that can go awry under the conditions of in-person voting. When you register, you may miss the deadline. You may move and not know that you have to re-register. There may be duplicates of you. There may be file errors of you. So some of these things have to do with you, but some of these things have to do with the election administrators. Then you have to find your polling location. And the question for many people is, where do I find this information? Where do I go? It is not common knowledge that a Secretary of State is the chief election official in states. And it is not common knowledge even that election departments exist in city and town governments and county governments. So that kind of information finding is tricky for voters and sometimes hard to even know where to go. And then you have to go to the polling location. And let's say you have your smartphone, you type it in, but you can't find it. Perhaps the signage isn't very good. Perhaps you're in the exact location and have no idea even where to go from there because of signage. Maybe when you get there, there's a long line and you feel that you don't have enough time to vote. Or maybe you have a disability and the polling location is not accessible. Several years ago, the General Accountability Office found that fully a third of polling locations were not accessible to people with disabilities. Then, when let's say you finally get past all of these challenges, it comes to the moment of identification, and maybe you lack the correct documentation. Then, if you do surpass that one, you have to then mark your ballot. And that may be challenging for you because maybe you have a disability and you have trouble with writing, or maybe you have can't see, or maybe you require language assistance. Those kinds of challenges are things where poll workers really come in to be of assistance, and the polling location has to be fully staffed to be able to provide the assistance to voters that they require. And particularly in the case of language assistance, we need to find people who speak the language that the voters are coming in with. And finally, you have to deposit your ballot for tabulation. And at that point, there could be machine error. It could be poorly calibrated tabulator, or it could be voter error. And if there's voter error, let's say you voted for the same person twice, you voted for the same office twice, whatever it is. Well, in most circumstances, the good thing about in-person voting is that we have a fail-safe. The machine should spit the ballot back to you, and it's a safety plan so that you can then go fill out your ballot again. So that leads us to voting by mail, because we don't have that same fail-safe dropped in. All right, so I'm going to now walk through voting by mail and go through the same process that we went through in the beginning. The series of distinct events in voting by mail. The first thing you need to do is register, same as before, apply for vote by mail, mark your ballot, and then deposit your ballot for tabulation, either in a mailbox, a drop box, or at a voting location, perhaps an early voting location. All right, so where can things go awry in this system? Well, as we've already documented, if it comes to voter registration, there are things that can go wrong there. You could miss the deadline, you could move, there could be duplicates or file errors. When you apply for vote by mail, the challenge here is the challenge of being a procrastinator. You have to really plan ahead. This is not something that you can do the night before the election. This is something that you have to do well in advance, and you have to figure out where and how, and if you decide that you're going to vote by mail, how do you know what the next step is? Maybe you get something in the mail, maybe you need to contact your election official. So there's materials you need to know. Then it comes to marking the ballot, and the same issues that are identified as being challenges under the voting in person system are the challenges that exist in a vote by mail system, but without necessarily the assistance that is required. So it can be challenging. And then think about this: what happens if you do go ahead and fill out the ballot, and you, because you're having difficulty with writing, perhaps you have Parkinson's disease, you make a mistake on that ballot, and you either have to get a new one, or you think it actually does indicate your intent, and then you put it in the mail. And then the question is there a fail-safe? So when you've deposited it, however you've deposited it, whether you put it in a drop box, in a mailbox, or a voting location, what are the things that can happen there? Well, number one, there's the challenge of lost votes. It could be that the Postal Service loses the mail, which does happen, or it could be that the election office loses the mail, which is unlikely, but it can happen. And then there's finally the challenge of rejection of returned ballots. So I'm going to then now look at some data about unreturned mail ballots in the 2014 and 2018 midterm elections. With the question of why were so many ballots not returned after voters had requested them. So this chart looks at the rate of unreturned mail ballots going from 0% all the way up to 40%. And the blue indicates 2018, the red indicates 2014. And you can see that the number of unreturned mail ballots is the number of ballots that were mailed minus the number received back. So the question is, did voters change their minds? Did they request them too late? Did they get lost in the mail? And unfortunately, we don't have answers to all of these questions. So this is something that we need to be aware of, but we can also try to address by making sure that communication to voters is crystal clear about what the challenges are. Then we can look at the effect of requesting a ballot too late. the increase in the number of unreturned ballots, the increase in the number of provisional ballots. So the concern in 2020 is that large numbers of people are going to go to a polling place with a notation on the poll book that they have an outstanding absentee ballot. And that may be a thing that will in fact cause some longer lines. Now we can look at just the state by state mail ballot rejection rate in 2016 and 2018. And what you can see is that the highest rates are in the states that have vote by mail. So that's actually not surprising. The most common reason that mail ballots are rejected is because of the signature on the envelope not matching the one on the registration record, or they are received after the deadline. So using data from the US Election Assistance Commission's Election Administration and Voting Survey, this measures rejected ballots as a percentage of all mail ballots cast. Okay, now finally, I want to look at poll workers and the critical role that they play. And so first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the profile of poll workers. They are older. The largest group is in their 60s. They are disproportionately female, and they're more likely to have a college degree than the general public. The first item, that they are older, is one of the concerns as we head into the general election in a global pandemic, because the concern is that many poll workers will opt out of being poll workers this year for health reasons. And that means that we have a replacement rate that we have to dramatically up. The good news is that there are organizations such as Power the Polls that are working really hard to try to recruit an entirely new generation of poll workers. But one of the things that we know about all of them, the new poll workers, is that we know that poll workers who are already trained don't always follow everything that they're supposed to do. Now, they are good people who are doing a lot of good work, so I am not trying to disparage in any way, but we have seen that there are disparities in the implementation of things like voter identification laws. And this deviates from state to state, election laws in many places. But the challenge is that the new group of poll workers that we have needs to get the training so that they can administer the election in a fair and equitable way. The good news is that in 2016, voter evaluation of poll worker performance was extremely high. 95% of survey respondents rated the job of the performance of their poll workers as excellent or good in 2016. And so this year, the challenges are, the challenge of now we have recruited all of these poll workers. How are we going to convert them to action, to staffing, to hiring, and to training? And so I think if we're going to look at anything that we have to do in October, in the month ahead, and we really do have a very limited amount of time, it is to make sure that all of these people, and I want to report happily that there are a lot of people who have signed up, but now the question is, how do we get them to actually become poll workers? And how do we make sure that they are very well trained when we can't do the same level of in-person training that we could do in normal circumstances, where they can actually hold the ballots, test out the machines, understand in their own bodies how a polling location is organized. So those are the challenges ahead, but certainly surmountable challenges. All right, so the challenges as well that we face as election administrators is certainly the US Postal Service. And this is something that is essentially out of the hands of election administrators. They are relying on an entity essentially beyond their control. They're working with them, but they are not the bosses of them. And so we have to trust that the Postal Service will deliver ballots in a timely manner. We have to recruit this new generation of poll workers, of people who are going to be learning on the job. And we also have to be aware that when we see lines on election day, or even during periods of early voting, the lines will likely look longer than they actually are because of social distancing and because of the things that have to go on in the polling location to make sure that there's only a certain number of people in there. So these may lead to impressions that lines are extremely long when in fact they are not. And finally, I want to talk about the role of voter confusion and misinformation and clear information. That the other task ahead of us in October is making sure that everybody who wants to register to vote knows how to register to vote. There was a survey done of young people that many of them did not even know where a stamp goes on the envelope. Now, most states do have online voter registration, but if you do not have a driver's license, you often have to print out that online voter registration and send it to the election office so that they can match you and make sure that everything adds up. That if our young people don't know where stamps go, we have to make sure that they do know that. We have to know how to advise people about where to vote, because there is a lot of confusion right now of people who are quarantined in one place, are moving to another, for whatever circumstance, are living in a different location than their residents. So those are all excellent questions and not necessarily ones that are totally easy to answer. So we have to make sure that we know in every single circumstance how to get people accurate information so they know what they're doing. And as we also know, we are just up to our eyeballs in misinformation, and the forces of evil are swooping in with misleading, incorrect information about voting, which threatens to demobilize us. The good news is good people are really working on this and trying to do their level best to provide this clear information. But I want to emphasize that it is grassroots election officials who are working at the highest levels to respond to this crisis. There are people who are advising the social media companies in how to provide clear information. There are people who are advising election offices about how to design their websites so that the information is clear. But it is up to all of us to be helpful to one another to make sure that people get the information that they need and can make the decisions that they need. There was a very good article yesterday in Politico, and now I just want to switch my slide there, by Ned Foley, who wrote the article, How to Know If the Election is Actually Rigged. And he said, disinformation does not in and of itself invalidate an election. Disenfranchisement, as abhorrent as it is, invalidates an election only when it exists on a large scale enough to affect the election's outcome. What matters isn't whether the process was perfect, but whether the democratic will of the people was served. And so as we head into this final time in this electoral process, we want to have enough trust that what we actually have in our election system is the will of the people. And there are media organizations such as USA Today, which are launching election season ad campaigns to fight fake news, and a lot of college campuses that are stepping in to be helpful on all of this. So the good news is there are a lot of people trying to do a lot of good things right now, and there is time to accomplish this. And ideally, things in November will go smoothly. Okay. I'm hoping that my screen share is off.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that. It's interesting. You've laid out so much of the nuts and bolts, the mechanics, uh, the problems facing the carrying out of the election. That your presentation, it seems to me, was at one and the same time very reassuring and somehow very alarming. So,
It's my goal.
yeah.
So that we can feel completely complex emotions that we can't solve.
I think we can add, I think we can safely add the election process to the list of things about our society that the coronavirus has laid bare, that
Yes,
we understand better because of the particular stresses that that's created on the system.
for sure.
Uh, Let me ask you this. The states vary widely in terms of their preparedness for the huge spike in mail-in voting that we're going to see. How concerned are you about a long, drawn-out count of several days or a week?
Well, I think this has to do with preparedness and has to do with states making sure that they have the people power that they need in order to pull off the count, the tabulators that they need to pull off the count, and the design of the system that they need to pull off the count. So I am hopeful that a lot of state and local election administrators who are anticipating a very high increase in mail ballots are going to really examine their systems, because I mean, let's look at it from just a purely cosmetic examination. No one wants to be on the front page of the New York Times the day after the election as being the problem state, right? No one wants to be the one that had the butterfly ballot of 2000. No one wants to be Florida. So given that, there is incentive beyond just doing the right thing that is propelling people to make sure that they are staffed up. And there are these organizations like the Healthy Election Project, and they're just a gazillion of them. I mean, not to the degree that it's dizzying, but a lot of sort of connected collaborating forces that are going to the places where they anticipate there will be problems, and saying, okay, maybe a state law change is in order here. For example, New York has a rule that it's not until the very end of the day that they can start tabulating some of the votes. Those are the kinds of legal hiccups that we don't need on election day. So I'm nervous, but I also think it's really important for everyone to take to say, okay, maybe it will take a little bit longer, but as long as it's not going to take a hugely long time, and there are really good, competent systems in place to handle this, I think we'll be okay.
Great. Let me shift gears a little bit. You co-authored a really excellent op-ed that appeared in today's Boston Globe. And in it, you state in 2016, 40% of eligible American voters did not cast a ballot. The only way to enact change is to be part of the solution. It's time for all of us to inspire our friends, family, and neighbors to vote in 2020 and in every election going forward. Every vote cast is a vote for the nation's future. So what I want to ask you about is the youth vote continues to be disappointing. I trust that much of our audience are in that youthful category. And it rose in the Obama elections of 2008 and 2012, but fell back in 2016. The midterm election in 2018 shows sizable gains, but young folks continue to lag way behind their elders as they have for decades. What's your view of why that is, and are you hopeful that we're seeing more engagement in 2020?
Okay, I'll start with, am I hopeful? Yes. And I am hopeful not only because I think I'm part of the crowd, the college professor crowd that is receiving a gazillion emails a day from good organizations trying to mobilize the youth vote in levels that I have never seen before. So the kind of on the ground work is happening. The other thing is we have had massive protests over the course of this year in this country. And one of the things that we know about protests is that they are mobilizing force for voting, and especially for young people. And I'll give you an interesting statistic. We asked 140 students in a webinar that we held a few weeks ago, how many of you have participated in a protest in the last 6 months? 75%. And this was not just political science majors. This was majors from across the university. So I do think that is going to, I think the participation gives you that sense that you can make a difference, and that leads to voting, as does many things. But the reason for the lower levels of voting among young people is both structural and sort of generational. So the structural reasons are that, you know, one of the things that I often talk about is when I had a baby in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I got this beautiful bag from the library that said "Born to Read" on it, and a bunch of books for my baby. And I realized, wow, you know, when I turned 18, I didn't get that bag of books about how to be a good citizen. Yeah. We don't do a very good job of inviting people in to this world of citizenship. And we don't teach civics. We're changing that, but we haven't been doing it for a really long time. And so what we end up with are a bunch of 18-year-olds who are sincere when they say, I don't know. I don't know who's running. I don't know how to vote. I don't know where to vote. And, you know, it's not osmotic. It is not something that just kind of comes to you at 18. So we as a society have to, I mean, we can do things like automatic voter registration, and there are all kinds of things that we can do kind of at the policy level, but also at the grassroots level, take young people by the hand and help them navigate this system so that they feel part of it and don't feel alienated and excluded. You know, the other thing about it is that this is a self-reinforcing virtuous circle if you are participating, and a vicious circle if you're not participating. So if you are participating, you know, the minute you vote, you're on the voter list. What does that mean? Campaigns are using those voter lists to then go back and ask you to vote again and again and again. So once you're on that list, you're part of the club. But before you're on that list, you're not part of the club, and nobody's doing outreach to you. So you don't even know that you're not part of the club until you join the club, right? Yeah. So those are some of the things we can do. And I mean, we could do an entire webinar on the youth vote, but I'll leave it at that.
One interesting thing is, at least here at Brown, Brown has just declared that Election Day will be a university holiday.
That's great. That's great. And those are the kinds of things that universities and schools and communities could do to help people. And, you know, it's also like a feel-good thing. And it sends an important message.
Let me ask you one more question quickly, and then we'll turn to the audience. There's been a lot in the media lately about the so-called red mirage or the blue shift. That is the credible possibility that President Trump will have a sizable lead late on election night because the in-person vote is expected to be more Republican, since Democrats are more likely to vote by mail. The concern is that President Trump will seem to be winning on election night, and that will change the days following as Democratic mail votes are counted. We can kind of anticipate, given past performance, how the president would respond to that. And, I just wanted to ask you, just how concerned are you about this prospect?
Well, like everything in 2020, I think there are things that can make you really nervous. And then you can think, okay, uh, where is that likely to happen? And who is the Secretary of State there? And what are they doing to assist to make sure that that doesn't happen? So I think we learned actually in the 2000 election that there was not only the counting of ballots and then the whole litigation that was going on around that, but there was also just public opinion. And because Bush was ahead at every count essentially that was noted on TV, there was kind of this like, well, let's just go with that because that's the way the results came, rather than let's really find out what the numbers tell us and what the results of the election were. So that, somewhat goes to the media and to the role of all of us to say, if we do not have the results that are going to tell us the likely winner, then we really have to let the good people who are counting these ballots do their job and do it in a safe way that's where we feel confident that it will be done carefully and well. I was not impressed with the media on the night of the Iowa caucus, and where we were not getting the results quickly, right? And members of the media were angry. They were angry that they didn't have the results. Their anger translates into other people feeling angry. That is not the emotion to have when we don't know the results of the election immediately. So we have to calibrate our emotional tenor about this stuff so that we can give people the space to do it. So I think there's a counter to the frenzy that's critical.
Well, that segues very well into our first audience question, which is from Ruby. She asks, if the election is close, will Trump take results to the Supreme Court?
Well, there's lots of stuff Trump will say he's going to do. But the next question is, what does the law say, and who is going to follow the law? We've already heard from him a lot of rhetoric that is inaccurate, and so he may well he may try to take it to the Supreme Court, but we have to work through the one thing to remember about elections in the United States is that it is at the state level. So it goes to the federal court only after we've exhausted the state court reviews of the matter. So I think he'll say stuff, but the main thing to know is, brush up on, if we get to that circumstance, brush up on your election law in that state and listen to the lawyers.
Yeah. Okay. Razika asks, the study showed that those who voted by mail were less likely to be confident about their vote. Since a majority of Democrats favor vote by mail, especially during the pandemic, would this now give them reason to abstain from voting as a whole due to its tedious nature? That is, would then Republicans have an advantage in the upcoming election?
Well, I think that we can look to recent history to help us understand. And by recent, I mean record turnout in some of these most recent primary elections, record turnout in the 2018 midterm. I don't think that the challenge of the tedium of voting by mail is going to depress turnout on a massive scale, especially among Democrats. I think there is, and especially with Democrats, their level of engagement and animation over this election is too high for the method of voting to sway them. But I do think that the results that we have from previous public opinion surveys about confidence levels in the voting method are things that we really need to pay attention to and understand, mostly because it helps us understand how to talk about the methods of voting right now, and to talk about how to have confidence in them. You know, we need to have a lot of news stories showing us exactly what happens when you mail your ballot. Where does it go? What happens? What are the security measures in place? What's the chain of command? Just educating ourselves about that is helpful. But then also knowing, as we do, that there are some significant mail problems right now. So what does that mean? It means that we just need to plan. So anybody who's sitting on their vote by mail application or whatever it is, like, now is not the time to procrastinate. Now is the time to take action, get that vote in if you want to put it in a mailbox.
Cornell's question really follows on that. He asks, which method of voting do you have the most confidence in?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll tell you, I first of all, in general, I have high confidence in our voting system. So this is not a voting system where I would say, hey, this is a mess. I mean, there are challenges, but I have high confidence. I think that seeing your ballot go through the machine is the thing that gives you probably the most confidence. So I think this is actually a personal feeling, but going to an early voting location, or depending on the state, right? I mean, all of this is depending on the state, because some states you can't, but going to an early voting location or going in person, to see that ballot go through the machine, I think is the thing that yields you feeling the most confident. But at the same time, you also need to feel safe and you need to feel healthy. And therefore, all of those things should lead you to using the method that is going to be the most calming to you on all of these levels.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about my local voting place. Won't be true this year because of coronavirus, but in the past, they've handed out hot dogs to voters who
Great,
cast their
great.
ballot. Pretty good methodology.
I know, not this year.
So Ben asks, so much has been made of the lack of poll workers and tabulators this cycle. Many people would feel more motivated to work the polls in a swing state instead of a non-competitive state. Are any states or municipalities accepting out-of-state volunteers to help work the polls, given the extraordinary circumstances this cycle? What about tabulators?
All right, well, Ben, that's a great question. Actually, I think there's a difference between tabulators and poll workers. And the main thing is, if you are essentially being hired by the election department to work at, for example, at City Hall and maybe not handle ballots, if you're not actually touching a ballot, the likelihood that the rules that apply to poll workers don't apply to you. So therefore, you can be a person who is working and hired by a municipality versus a poll worker where sometimes you have to be a registered voter, sometimes you have to be living in that locale. There are so many different rules about this that I can't even begin to tell you what state is the state that has this or that. We have to look it up, and even when we look it up, things have changed. Laws have changed recently to loosen these regulations. But I would say that, look, every place needs competent people, even not, I mean, so it might be a swing state on the presidential level, but it might not be a swing state on other offices. And regardless of whether the election is going to be close or not close, we need to have great people working across the United States as this whole, community of good people doing the right thing by our election system.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more, so I'll pick a brief question. probably won't have a brief answer, but Robin asks, can you please address the question of reinstating felon voting? She cites Florida and the current legal battle, but I think it's an issue in a lot of states across the country.
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole other talk, and I have to say, although I am up to speed on some of it, I'm not up to speed on the whole thing. But I guess the main takeaway here is that there is still a long way to go with voting rights in the United States, and the idea that the U.S. has, that the story of voting in the United States has been a story of expansion, of giving the right to many, and so that now we have universal voting is simply not true. And there are these states that have determined that even after you have served your time, you have lost forever the right to vote. And so that's of the struggles that lie ahead for voting rights, that is one of the big ones.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rachel. This has really been great, and I can use my special powers. I'm able to hear the large applause from the audience. Thank you for that presentation.